Hello everyone, welcome to the integrated session of Biochemistry and Pediatrics. I am Dr. Rebecca James, the Faculty of Biochemistry.
I'm Dr. Singaram, Faculty of Pediatrics. In this session, we'll be discussing about some integrated cases in biochemistry and pediatrics, where we'll be telling you about how to approach the particular case as well as the answer for that particular question, and some basics in biochemistry, which will be very relevant for answering other questions in that particular case.
So, why the integrated session is important? Number one, the curriculum of MBBS has changed from a fragmented curriculum to an integrated curriculum. So definitely the competitive exam that is going to come after the MBBS, which you are all working for, the NEET or next, whatever is it, it should be in an integrated pattern. That's why the importance of integrated session and the integrated way of learning. Second thing is that if we see a human body, we know that every system is important. We are working together. It's a teamwork. So just like that, in a medical curriculum, we cannot fragment all the subjects and learn. We have to integrate it and learn. So there comes the importance of integrated way of learning.
So we will start with the first case, a 28-day-old neonate born out of second-degree consanguineous marriage, presented with history of feeding difficulty and poor activity of 2 days duration. There is no history of vomiting, fever, umbilical discharge, rash or seizures. Birth weight is 2.7 kg and the baby was born at term, normal vaginal delivery with no complications at birth. He has been exclusively breastfed since birth. On examination, the baby is lethargic with a poor suck and sluggish neonatal reflexes. Examination was otherwise unremarkable and the weight at admission was 3 kg. This is the baseline data we have, and you see the next part of the question regarding the investigations. Investigations were remarkable for elevated WBC count with neutrophil predominance and elevated micro ESR and CRP. The blood glucose was low, calcium, CSF studies, urine analysis and liver profile all were normal. The diagnosis of neonatal sepsis was presumed and the baby was started on antibiotics, to which the baby responded to IV ceftriaxone and amikacin. The blood cultures were sent and the cultures grew E. coli, which was sensitive to cefotaxime and amikacin. So this baby also had a remarkable past history of being admitted and discharged for E. coli sepsis on day 5 of life. So very clearly it is implied that it is a second episode of E. coli sepsis in this particular baby. Now the questions are, which underlying disorder should be suspected and which additional investigations may help in the diagnosis. As you could see that it was a long history comprising of the clinical remarks in this child as well as the investigation findings in this particular child. We have to interpret both and come to an answer. Before that, we can have an approach to this particular case in a step-by-step fashion. First important history which was given in the beginning of the question itself was that the baby was born of consanguineous marriage. You have to think about inherited disorders like recessive disorders, autosomal recessive or X-linked recessive disorders. Second thing, very important, was a very important history that the baby was having feeding difficulty, poor activity in the neonatal period. And any history like this, you always have to think about sepsis, because that is one of the important causes of mortality in the neonatal period, and it typically presents like this. In this particular case also, sepsis was suspected. In fact, it was confirmed with the blood culture also, to which the baby promptly responded to IV antibiotic. But sepsis alone is not the diagnosis in this particular case, because we have some additional problems also in this baby in the form of recurrent E. coli sepsis. Remember, a baby can have sepsis in the neonatal period, but having recurrent sepsis, and that too due to E. coli, would signal an underlying disorder in this particular baby, which has to be worked upon. We had also additional clues in the form of hypoglycemia. Please remember, hypoglycemia had occurred in the setting of an exclusive breastfeeding baby. That means some link to the metabolic disorder has to be thought of at this particular stage. Third important history was regarding the weight. The birth weight was 2.7 kg. Now the baby is 28 days, but still the weight is only 3 kg, which very clearly says that there is inadequate weight gain in this particular baby, in spite of being exclusively breastfed. So recurrent E. coli sepsis, hypoglycemia in spite of exclusive breastfeeding, as well as failure to adequately gain weight would point to the diagnosis of galactosemia in this particular child. Please remember, it's a very important metabolic disorder in the carbohydrate, which has to be considered in any baby having any of the features, the most important being hypoglycemia and symptoms like vomiting, seizures, or jaundice with hepatomegaly. And any of this, if present in the neonatal period, should always, one, to think about the diagnosis of galactosemia. One more important clinical history which was given, which made me think about the diagnosis of galactosemia, was recurrent E. coli sepsis, which also has to be considered in the clinical setting.
So, Dr. Singaram has well explained how to arrive at a diagnosis when a clinical history like that is given to you. Now, let's dive into the basics. What is the role of galactose in our body? In our body, the role of galactose is two things. Number one, to synthesize lactose. That comes in a lactating mother. In the mammary gland, the lactose has to be synthesized. The second role of galactose in our body is to synthesize complex carbohydrates. So, to synthesize complex carbohydrates, galactose is needed. And which are these complex carbohydrates? It means the glycolipids, the proteoglycans, etc. So, that's the role of galactose in our body, right? So, once through the diet, if the galactose is coming to our body, what's the source of galactose? The most important source of galactose is the milk sugar, that is lactose. Now, through the lactose, if you are taking galactose, now this galactose has to be first phosphorylated. Which is the enzyme that is phosphorylating? It is the galactokinase. Now, once the galactose 1-phosphate is formed by phosphorylation, it is taking the UDP from UDP glucose and it is becoming UDP galactose, right? Now, this UDP galactose is used for the lactose synthesis, or it can be used for the complex synthesis of the complex carbohydrate. So, this is the metabolic pathway for galactose. Now, where comes the defect in case of galactosemia? The classic galactosemia, the defect comes in the galactose 1-phosphate uridyl transferase. Now, if galactose 1-phosphate uridyl transferase is defective, what's going to accumulate in our body? What is going to accumulate is the galactose 1-phosphate. What will happen if galactose 1-phosphate is accumulating? The galactose 1-phosphate, if it is accumulating, it becomes toxic. How it becomes toxic? It is not in a direct way it's becoming toxic, in an indirect way. What is the indirect way? That is, whenever we are taking galactose in our diet, this galactose will be getting phosphorylated and it is becoming the galactose 1-phosphate. So, what will happen? All the inorganic phosphate. So, if I'm writing PI, it means that it is inorganic phosphate. So, these inorganic phosphates will be trapped as the galactose 1-phosphate. So, in the body, there will be a deficiency of this inorganic phosphate, right? So, if there is a deficiency of inorganic phosphate, how it is going to affect the body? One very important organ that's affected is the liver. And see, if there is a deficiency of inorganic phosphate, another metabolic pathway is affected, that is the glycogen phosphorylase. Glycogen phosphorylase. If you remember that the reaction of glycogen phosphorylase, I'll show it later also. So, in that reaction, inorganic phosphate is required. So, here there is a deficiency of inorganic phosphate. So, what will happen? It will affect the glycogen phosphorylase. What is the function of glycogen phosphorylase? It is the enzyme for glycogenolysis. So, if glycogenolysis is going to get affected, what's going to happen? There is decreased glycogenolysis. If there is decreased glycogenolysis, the baby is going to have fasting hypoglycemia. Why I am saying fasting hypoglycemia? It is because the glycogenolysis is taking place during the early fasting. So, in a well-fed child, it won't happen. But in the stages of fasting, in early stages of fasting, when glycogen has to be used, then there is a chance of hypoglycemia. Right? So, this is the metabolic defect in the classic galactosemia. I just want to give you two more things, that is, apart from galactose 1-phosphate uridyl transferase deficiency, two more enzyme deficiency can cause galactosemia, but it is not classic galactosemia. Number one is the galactokinase deficiency. The second one is the UDP hexose isomerase. That is, this deficiency also causes galactosemia, but these two are not classic galactosemia. Then one more point I just want to add here is, What is the reason for cataract here? Usually in the neonatal stage, the development of cataract may not be that much manifested like the child that we have learned just now, but later the cataract will set in. Why? Because this galactose, if it is accumulating, it get accumulated in the lens. In the lens, there is an enzyme which is called as the aldose reductase. This is not normally acting, and this enzyme is there, but only when the galactose level increases and it enter into the lens, this galactose can be converted to galactitol or dulcitol. So this galactitol or dulcitol is the reason for the cataract in galactosemia. Cataract in galactosemia.
So ma'am has very clearly explained about the basis of galactose metabolism as well as the implications in galactosemia. So we can conclude very clearly that this was a case of classical galactosemia in this particular child. So in comparison with galactosemia, there is also another related metabolic disorder which you should know of, called as HFI, which is hereditary fructose intolerance. So it's something similar to galactose but involves the fructose pathway. That is the point to be noted. I'll do a detailed comparison in the next slide, but just a main important clinical distinction between the two things are when do the clinical features start. In hereditary fructose intolerance, it starts after 6 months. It is very easily understandable because fructose will be introduced in the diet only after 6 months when the baby is getting the complementary feeds. That is the time when you start introducing the fructose or its parent sucrose in the diet. So signs and symptoms will start after 6 months of age. The second point to be noted is the clinical features are almost similar to galactosemia, like hepatomegaly, hypoglycemia, jaundice, vomiting. But the important distinguishing point is cataract is not a feature of HFI. So very clearly in hereditary fructose intolerance, cataract is not a feature. Now a detailed comparison between galactosemia and hereditary fructose intolerance. The age at onset we have already discussed, clinical features already discussed. But please don't forget, there is no cataract in hereditary fructose intolerance. Enzyme defect is galactose 1-phosphate uridyl transferase deficiency in galactosemia, whereas in HFI, it is aldolase B. The accumulating substance, as we have seen from the pathway, is galactose 1-phosphate in galactosemia, whereas it is fructose 1-phosphate for hereditary fructose intolerance. Investigation in galactosemia and fructosemia, because they are reducing sugars, the urine reducing substance will always be positive. Only the specific test for this enzyme assay or the direct enzyme assay will be the distinguishing points in the lab between galactosemia and hereditary fructose intolerance. Treatment is complete elimination of lactose from the diet in galactosemia, whereas fructose and sucrose has to be eliminated in the diet for hereditary fructose intolerance.
So from case 1, we are now moving on to another case. This is a 3-year-old boy presented with the following peculiar appearance: protuberant abdomen, short stature with upper segment lower segment ratio of 1:1. Additional findings on examination include obstructive sleep apnea and thickening of cardiac valves. There is history of similar features in first degree male relatives. All the following findings can also be noted in this child. All the following findings can be noticed in this child except intellectual disability, hepatosplenomegaly, corneal clouding, dysostosis multiplex. So what is your answer?
So this was an interesting case, and I will tell you about the clinical approach to this particular case. One very striking finding was the males affected in the family, which would probably point out that it was a X-linked recessive disorder. Second important was the clinical features, in that the very striking one was the abnormal facies. I will just go back to that slide and will show the abnormalities in that particular face. You can see very clearly that the child is having a prominent forehead. The nose is flat and the tip of the nose is upturned. The next important point you are saying as a whole is the coarseness of the face. And then one more important finding is macroglossia. And this typical facial appearance is described as gargoylic facies. You must be knowing that gargoyle is like it's something related to the medieval ages, where it is like a picture of an abnormal looking face in front of the buildings. Like that, this child is also having a typical abnormal gargoylic facies. One more important point was regarding the short stature. Very, very important point is regarding the short stature. And very clearly, they are telling you about something called US-LS ratio, which is upper segment, lower segment ratio of 1:1. In this particular child, the child was 3 years. A normal 3-year-old child should have an upper segment, lower segment ratio of 1.3:1. So this child definitely is having a low upper segment, lower segment ratio, which was very clearly telling you that there is a problem in the upper segment. That is why the ratio was also low. Upper segment basically comprises of the spinal column. So this particular child might have some problem in the spinal column or the vertebral bones, which would have resulted in shortening of the spinal column or low upper segment, lower segment ratio. So we have a child who is having an abnormal face, short stature. In addition, in the history, it was very clearly given the child was also having organomegaly. All this points to a diagnosis of mucopolysaccharidosis. There are different types of mucopolysaccharidosis which you must be knowing, and among the different types, I would like to propose the diagnosis as Hunter syndrome because of very important reasons. One is in the first line of this slide itself, that is X-linked recessive. Of all the mucopolysaccharidosis, the male children are only affected in Hunter syndrome because it's a X-linked recessive disorder. Second important clue was that there was no findings in the cornea. Generally, corneal clouding is a feature of other mucopolysaccharidosis except in Hunter syndrome, where the cornea is very, very clear. Just to give you an insight about the vertebral abnormalities that this child can have, the vertebral abnormalities would include something like this, which you're seeing in the picture, that the end of the vertebral bone is not regularly shaped, but it is showing some beaking. It is showing some beaking. This is what we call it as a beaking of the vertebra in case of mucopolysaccharidosis. This is one abnormality in the bone. Mucopolysaccharidosis can also have other abnormalities in the other bones also, the very prominent of which is tapering of the metacarpals, what we call it as a bullet-shaped metacarpals. So because mucopolysaccharidosis involves multiple bones, this finding of bone involvement in mucopolysaccharidosis is also called as dysostosis multiplex. That's also one more important finding. So in this particular case, the diagnosis is very clearly Hunter syndrome. Please note that the additional findings of obstructive sleep apnea and thickening of the cardiac valves can also be seen in mucopolysaccharidosis. Now this question was asking, all of the findings can also be noted except, that means we need to know about the other findings of mucopolysaccharidosis. Look at the first finding, intellectual disability or low IQ definitely is present in Hunter syndrome, so it will be present. Second is hepatosplenomegaly, and that may be one of the reasons why this child was having protuberant abdomen also. So hepatosplenomegaly is also an associated feature of mucopolysaccharidosis. As I gave in my description, corneal clouding is not a feature of Hunter syndrome, and that will be the answer for this particular question. Dysostosis multiplex is nothing but involvement of multiple bones, which is again characteristic of mucopolysaccharidosis as well as in Hunter syndrome also. So the answer for this particular question is corneal clouding is not seen in this particular child because this child is a case of Hunter syndrome where the cornea is clear.
So we have seen a case of Hunter disease. Or now, what is the basic problem in mucopolysaccharidosis? The basic problem in mucopolysaccharidosis is inside the lysosomes, the mucopolysaccharides are being degraded by certain lysosomal hydrolases enzyme. So when there is a deficiency of these enzymes, what will happen is that inside the lysosomes, the mucopolysaccharides are getting accumulated. And this set of disorders, we call it as mucopolysaccharidosis. If we just will revise all the mucopolysaccharidosis, number one is the mucopolysaccharidosis 1, MPS 1, which is otherwise the Hurler disease. Like in the Hurlers, what is the enzyme defect? The enzyme defect is L-iduronidase. L-iduronidase. And in the MPS 1, there are two sets, MPS 1H and MPS 1S. The MPS 1S, we all know it is Shee's disease, and the enzyme that is defective there is the same enzyme alpha L-iduronidase itself, or simply L-iduronidase. But the difference between these two is that in one case, that is, in the first case, it is a complete defect in the enzyme, whereas in the MPS 1S, the partial activity of that enzyme is preserved. Then we have the Hunter disease. The enzyme that is defective is, yes, it is alpha L-iduronate sulfatase, alpha L-iduronate sulfatase. Now, MPS 3 is otherwise the Sanfilippo, which is the most common mucopolysaccharidosis. The most common mucopolysaccharidosis is MPS 3. It has several enzyme defects, and it is not possible for us to learn all the enzyme defects. So what we can understand is that this is something which is affecting the enzymes that degrade a mucopolysaccharide, which is called as the heparin sulfate. So just learn that much. Now going to the MPS 4, it's otherwise the MORQ. In MORQ, the enzyme that is defective is 2. There are 2 MORQs, A and B. So A, the defect is the galactosamine 6 sulfatase, and the second B, that is MORQ B, is beta galactosidase. So here also I won't force you to learn this enzyme defect, because more important is the 1 and the 2, that is Hurler, Hunter and the She. Now going to the MPS 6. MPS 6 is otherwise the Moretti-Lamy disease, and here the enzyme that is defective is N-acetyl galactosamine 4 sulfatase. So these two, I will definitely say, don't remember the name of the enzyme, but always remember these 3: iduronate sulfatase and iduronidase. Don't forget that. Now going to the different clinical features in various mucopolysaccharidosis, if we see the first one, that is the mental deficiency. Mental deficiency or intellectual disability is not present in certain mucopolysaccharidosis. Number 1 is the She's. In She's, there is no intellectual disability. Then comes the MORQ and Moretti-Lamy. So just remember these. Rather than learning everything, you just learn which are the exceptions. So these 3 are the exception where there is no intellectual disability. Now going to the coarse facial features. The coarse facial features is not classically present in Sanfilippo and MORQ, but I don't think that this is something that we can always generalize and learn, and I don't think this is very much important also. Like, you just learn in almost every mucopolysaccharidosis there is coarse facial features. So, but the next one is very important, the corneal clouding. So that was the one which was asked in the question also. The corneal clouding, which all MPS, the corneal clouding is not present. The corneal clouding, every MPS there is corneal clouding, but there are exceptions. Number 1 is the Hunter. You all know the Hunters should have a clear vision. So that's something which we all say. So there is no corneal clouding in Hunter. And the next one will be the Sanfilippo to some extent, but always remember the Hunter, that you should never forget. So there is no corneal clouding in Hunter. Regarding the visceromegaly is present in almost all MPS, but it is not present. The visceromegaly is not present in MORQ. Visceromegaly is not present in MORQ. Then going to the short stature, almost every mucopolysaccharidosis there is short stature. So that is present, in every mucopolysaccharidosis, short stature is present. Dysostosis multiplex is also another bone deformity which is uniformly present in all mucopolysaccharidosis. It's present in all mucopolysaccharidosis. And regarding the leukocyte inclusion, which is the leukocyte inclusion in MPS Rayleigh body, like that leukocyte inclusion is not present in MORQ. It's not present in MORQ. In all other MPS, the leukocyte inclusion is present. Now going to the last one, the MPS in urine, which is a very important investigation. We usually do the urine mucopolysaccharidosis test. It's a spot test. So MPS is present in every mucopolysaccharidosis. So there is mucopolysaccharides present in urine in all MPS. So these are some general things that you can remember. Always the most important thing that is usually asked in the exam will be the corneal clouding and the mental retardation, otherwise the intellectual disability. These 2 are the most important thing that you should be knowing.
We now move on to the third interesting case, which is about a 10-month-old boy who is on cow milk feed, presents with a diarrhea of 3 weeks duration, accompanied with the perianal rashes and abnormally gaseous stools. What are the additional investigations to arrive at a diagnosis? Before we answer the question of investigation, we should first know about the diagnosis, then we can comment on the investigations. We can just put up it into 2 parts as to how to approach this case. There were 2 important clues here. One was related to the symptoms being starting after the cow milk intake. Whenever we talk about cow milk or any milk for that reason, it is something which is related to the most important carbohydrate present, which is nothing but the lactose. Second important thing should be the correlation with the diarrhea. You can see that usual diarrhea in children lasts for less than 1 week. We call it as acute diarrhea. But any diarrhea, like in this case, which is of 3 weeks, or any diarrhea which is lasting for more than 2 weeks itself, we call it as persistent diarrhea. So we need to correlate two things. One is the diarrhea and along with the exposure to cow milk or lactose in that. So if we put these two things together, we can arrive at a diagnosis of something where the child is not able to metabolize or tolerate the lactose due to persistent diarrhea, and that is what we call it as lactose intolerance. Because this is something which is acquired due to diarrhea, we can call it as lactose, secondary lactose intolerance. To compare with the primary lactose intolerance, there the problem starts from the birth itself. Here it is only due to secondary to diarrhea it is starting. So I will call this case as secondary lactose intolerance.
So we have seen that is the case of lactose intolerance. Where is the defect in lactose intolerance? The defect is in an enzyme which is usually synthesized in the intestinal cell, and that is a lactase enzyme. So normally, what is the time when the lactase enzyme starts to appear in our cell? Like by 6 to 8 weeks of gestation, 6 to 8 weeks of gestation, the lactase enzyme start to secrete. Now, when the child is around 22 to 32 weeks, in and around this time, there will be it starts to rise. So it start begin to synthesize by about 6 to 8 weeks of gestation. Now, when the child is around 20 weeks onwards, it starts to rise, and finally, 1 month after birth, it peaks, and later on, after 1 month, it starts to peak, and afterwards, it starts to decline. The amount of the enzyme production in the body starts to decline, and it reaches the adult level by 7 to 10 years of age. So by 7 to 10 years of age, the lactase enzyme will reach the adult level. And what is the normal adult level? It's less than 10%. That is, when we compare it to the maximum, it is only less than 10%. So that is the usual way where this lactase enzyme is normally synthesized in our body. Now, what will happen if there is no lactase enzyme? So if there is a deficiency of lactase enzyme, what happens is that the milk sugar is not getting digested. That's a common logic that we all know. Now, why the clinical presentation? Like, if the lactose is not getting digested by the lactase enzyme, then there is somebody else who is taking over this lactose, and it starts fermenting these lactose. You know, the fermentation, by the action of fermentation, what will happen to the lactose? It is converted to its lactate or lactic acid. So this is getting converted to lactic acid. Now, when it is getting converted to lactic acid, along with it, something else is also being produced. What are they? Certain gases. Certain gases will be produced, like methane, then hydrogen. So these gases will be produced as a result of this fermentation. So that is one thing, and that is why there is flatulence in case of lactose intolerance. Now, the second thing is that this lactic acid that is produced is osmotically active. Now, what will happen as a result of this? It will take up the water, and you can see there is a fluid overload. This leads to distension of the gut wall, and there is increased peristalsis. And along with this lactase, like the lactose is not getting digested, along with that, because of this increased peristalsis, there will be malabsorption of other nutrients like the fat and the proteins, and know that because of this fluid overload, there is watery diarrhea. So this is the basic or the biochemical basis of all the clinical manifestation that we have just seen in a case of lactose intolerance.
So, ma'am has very clearly correlated the clinical findings in this particular child and the diagnosis of lactose intolerance. So, very clearly you can correlate the perianal rashes and abnormally gaseous stools. Perianal rashes is probably due to the lactic acid which has come out of the intestine and causing irritation of the skin in the perianal region. Second is abnormally gaseous stools, which are due to the production of hydrogen and methane due to the process of fermentation of lactose in the gastrointestinal tract. So this very clearly brings us to the diagnosis of lactose intolerance, and because it is associated with persistent diarrhea, we call it as secondary lactose intolerance. So what are the investigations to arrive at the diagnosis? There are two things to be remembered here. One is the stool reducing substance would be positive. Second thing is if you do the stool pH, because lactic acid is getting excreted, the stool pH will be acidic or it will be less than 5.1. So in conclusion, I would also like to add how we manage this child with lactose intolerance, as obviously lactose should be very, very restricted, or better that no lactose in the diet is what is preferable. So if there is no lactose in the diet, what are the alternative options for managing these children? First of all, we will not just give a no lactose diet. We will give a low lactose in the sense that we are actually diluting the milk by adding the milk with the rice and making it like a gruel, what we call it as milk rice gruel, as we see in the picture. Second thing is we can add the milk with the suji, what we call it as a milk suji gruel, and then give it to the child. Once the diarrhea starts dissolving and the patient starts improving, we can gradually introduce more and more of milk in the diet. So this is applicable only for secondary lactose intolerance. Whereas if the child is a primary lactose intolerance, then strictly no lactose has to be introduced into the diet. So low lactose diet to start with in case of secondary lactose intolerance, and strictly no lactose in the diet for primary lactose intolerance.
So now we'll begin with the case 4. A 15-month-old child present to emergency with complaints of 2 days history of vomiting, diarrhea, along with poor feeding and decreased activity. On examination, the child is lethargic with poor responsiveness. The blood sugar is 30 mg per deciliter. Hepatomegaly was also noticed. Other significant investigations include bicarbonate of 9 milliequivalents and lactate is 17 millimoles per liter. Mother recalls a similar illness in the child 2 months back. Which of the following group of disorder should be considered as the highest probability in this child? Is it urea cycle disorder? Or is it glycogen storage disorder, mitochondrial disorder, or lysosomal storage disorder? That will be clearly explained by Dr. Singaram sir.
Thank you, ma'am, for the description of the case. So you can see that all the 4 given options are metabolic disorders. So before I start discussing the answer, I will first will tell you how to approach this particular case, or in the first instance, how to think of a metabolic disorder. Please remember, metabolic disorder can have 2 patterns. One is that the child will be showing some deteriorations on a short-term basis, but it will be repeatedly occurring. So what I call it as acute deterioration, recurrent episodes. The second presentation of inborn error metabolism would be something like a chronic disorder involving multiple systems. In this particular question, it was very clearly child having gastroenteritis and then showing some deterioration. But that was not only one episode, there was a previous episode also. So this is a type of IEM which is presenting as recurrent episodes of acute deterioration. So with this presentation itself, I can rule out a lysosomal storage disorder, basically because lysosomal storage disorder will not have acute presentations. They will be something like a chronic type of disorder where the onset will be insidious or a gradual onset, and the child will show some progressive deterioration, right? So because the presentation given the question was acute, I will rule out lysosomal storage disorder. Now, you have got other important pointers in the question also, in the form of 1, hypoglycemia, and second is lactic acidosis. That is what was described, because you could have very clearly noticed that the lactate levels were given and it was actually high lactate which was noted in this child. So that is lactic acidosis. So two main pointers, hypoglycemia and lactic acidosis. With these two important clinical points, I can rule out urea cycle disorder. Why? Because in urea cycle disorder, the presentation is not with hypoglycemia and lactic acidosis, rather it is with hyperammonemia, where the child would typically present with some features of cerebral edema, wherein the child will show some deterioration in the central nervous system like seizures, child going in for unconsciousness like that. And very clearly it should have been mentioned in the question, for most of the urea cycle disorder, there will be high levels of ammonia on investigation, which was not given in this case. So I can easily rule out urea cycle disorder as well in this particular case. So that brings us to two remaining options in this particular case, which are characterized by hypoglycemia and lactic acidosis. That is, mitochondrial disorders are a possibility and glycogen storage disorders are a possibility. I will put forth my diagnosis as glycogen storage disorder because of one more important clinical clue given in the question, that was hepatomegaly. Hepatomegaly is usually not a feature of mitochondrial disorder. It is only a feature of glycogen storage disorder, and to be precise, it is liver glycogen storage disorder. We'll be seeing about the different type of glycogen storage disorders shortly. But just wanted to give you a clue that among the liver glycogen storage disorder, von Guericke disease, or the type 1 glycogen storage disorder, is the most common type and the highly likely possibility in this particular child.
So once we have arrived at a diagnosis of glycogen storage disorder, particularly in this case, it is a liver glycogen storage disorder and highly pointing towards von Guericke's disease. We all know this pathway, that is the glycogen synthesis as well as glycogenolysis. So this disorder is related to this pathway, where we can see the glycogen is being, so on one side what you're seeing is the glycogen is being degraded by the enzyme glycogen phosphorylase, and then we can see the debranching enzyme is also acting here, and later on it forms the like the glucose 1-phosphate is finally converted to glucose, right? So this pathway is well explained in the videos of the glycogen metabolism. So here I will be just brushing through the glycogen storage disorder correlated with this pathway. And on the other side, what we are seeing is the glycogen synthesis, where the glucose is converted to glucose 6-phosphate to this glucose 1-phosphate, and finally it is getting converted to the glycogen. So in this metabolic pathway, the enzyme defect that can lead to liver glycogen storage disorder, the most common one, the first one that we have described, and in this particular case is the von Guericke's disease. Where is the enzyme defect in von Guericke's disease? It is von Guericke's, otherwise the type 1 glycogen storage disorder. The enzyme defect is here, that is glucose 6-phosphatase. What will happen if there is glucose 6-phosphatase defect? The glucose 6-phosphate, which is the end product of glycogen, not end product, the intermediate product of glycogenolysis, is not getting converted to glucose. So what will happen? There is hypoglycemia. In that case also you can see there is decreased blood glucose. Remember, this hypoglycemia, not only the glucose level will reduce, one thing is that because of decreased glycogenolysis, because that comes in the glycogenolysis pathway, then once when the glycogen is not able to be lysed by the body, then what is the next source of blood glucose? The next source of blood glucose is gluconeogenesis, right? So we know that the gluconeogenesis, the non-carbohydrate sources, is the one which is being converted to glucose. In that also we know that the final step of the gluconeogenesis is the glucose 6-phosphate being converted to glucose, right? Now, if in that case also, if the glycogenolysis is not taking place, the next thing is gluconeogenesis, and even that is not taking place because of the defect in that enzyme, which is the final step, right? So there is severe hypoglycemia in a case of von Guericke's disease. Apart from that, we know that the glycogen is not properly degraded, and hence you can see that there is no glycogenolysis as well. And apart from that, which are the biochemical hallmarks? The one which we have seen here in that particular case is lactic acidosis. Why there is lactic acidosis? Because we know that there is excess glucose 6-phosphate, which is going to glycolysis. We know that there are different glycolysis, that is aerobic and anaerobic glycolysis. And finally, we know that if there is excess glucose 6 phosphate, this can go for anaerobic glycolysis as well. So there is production of lactic acid or lactate. So that is why there is lactic acidosis, because of excess glucose 6 phosphate. The second thing is that, what is the next biochemical hallmark, which is not given in that particular case, is that hyperuricemia. Why there is hyperuricemia? If there is excess glucose 6 phosphate, then we know that this can go for the HMP pathway, otherwise the pentose phosphate pathway, which accumulates what? Pentoses. What is the end product of when the pentoses is accumulating, it goes to what? Purine. So if the purines are accumulating, what is the end product? The uric acid. So there is accumulation of uric acid as well. So these are some of the biochemical hallmarks of von Gerke's disease. Now, in the liver glycogen storage disorder, the other enzyme defect that can cause liver glycogen storage disorder is the defect in the debranching enzyme. If there is a defect in the debranching enzyme, it causes Curies disease. Curies disease. Curies disease is otherwise called as limit dextrinosis. Limit dextrinosis. And if you are saying the type, what is the type? It is type 3 glycogen storage disorder. Type 3 glycogen storage disorder. Is there any other defect which can cause in this particular diagram which I have shown? Another defect that can also cause liver glycogen storage disorder, and that is the defect in branching enzyme. If there is a defect in the branching enzyme, it causes Anderson disease. Anderson disease, otherwise called as amylopectinosis. Amylopectinosis. Okay, so these are the various liver glycogen storage disorder. I didn't give all the types, but the most important one. So if we go through all the glycogen storage disorder, the most important one, the liver glycogen storage disorder, von Gerke's, what is the enzyme defect? It is the glucose 6 phosphatase. Glucose 6 phosphatase. Now in Curies disease, where was the enzyme defect? It is in the debranching enzyme. Debranching enzyme. Now in the case of Anderson disease, what was the enzyme defect? The branching enzyme. And you all know the common mnemonic that we learned, A, B, C, D. That is in Anderson, the defect is in the branching enzyme. In Curies disease, the defect is in the debranching enzyme. Now, the major clinical features which will help you to distinguish between the various liver glycogen storage disorder. One thing that is common to all liver glycogen storage disorder is hypoglycemia. Why? Because the glycogen, if it is affected, then there is hypoglycemia, right? So the hypoglycemia is common to almost every liver glycogen storage disorder. Now, in the history that we have just seen, we have seen there is hepatomegaly. Sir has also pointed out that is there is hepatomegaly, which is pointing towards it is a liver glycogen storage disorder, and the most common one is the von Gerke's disease. Now, there is, when various liver glycogen storage disorders are asked for the exam, the two common thing that can confuse you is the Curies disease and the von Gerke's disease. One very important megaly that will help you to distinguish between von Gerke and the Curies disease will be the renomegaly. The renomegaly is usually seen in von Gerke's disease, not in Curies disease. Now, so there is no renomegaly here. Now, another, like in the case of von Gerke's disease, what we have seen is there is lactic acidosis, there is hyperuricemia. But in the case of Curies disease, the lactate and the uric acid level is normal. Again, that distinguishes between the von Gerke's and the Curies disease to an extent. Then hepatic symptoms. The hepatic symptoms is more severe in the case of Curies disease when it is compared to von Gerke's disease, where there is chances for cirrhosis in the case of Curies disease. Now, coming to the Anderson disease, Anderson disease is more fatal when it is compared to Curies disease. It's a fatal condition where it goes to progressive cirrhosis, portal hypertension, and death at an early stages of life due to liver failure. So, it is a very fatal condition where the death is due to liver failure. So the hepatic symptoms is very severe in the case of Anderson disease. So that is a rough brushing up through all the liver glycogen storage disorders.
So, ma'am has very clearly correlated the findings of glycogen storage disorders in the liver along with the correlation with the biochemistry. We'll now move on to the next case, case 5, which is about a previously well 3-week-old baby presenting with the complaints of breathing difficulty and poor feeding of 2 days duration. On examination, you see that the baby is floppy, baby is tachypnic with a heart rate of 140 and acyanotic. SpO2 is 92% in the room air, and cardiovascular examination findings were clinically normal. Other notable findings were macroglossia, hepatomegaly with scattered crepitation in lung fields, and the blood investigations, routine investigations were normal. But you can see that in ECG, there was short PR interval with features of left ventricular hypertrophy, which was confirmed by echocardiography, and it was showing in addition hypokinesia of the left ventricle as well. Serum aspartate transaminase and alanine transaminase were mildly elevated. Creatinine phosphokinase is 1123. The normal is 200, so that is also elevated. Which of the following should be done to confirm the diagnosis in this particular baby? You can see the options: estimation of troponin I, estimation of muscle phosphorylase, estimation of alpha glucosidase, and estimation of uric acid and lipid levels. When we go back to the history, you can see that to give a rough idea, this is a neonate because the child is only 3 weeks old, presenting with something which is related to an emergency where the child has breathing difficulty, tachypnea with increased heart rate, and the other thing was the child was floppy. And you can see that additional findings are also noted like macroglossia, hepatomegaly with elevation of liver enzymes. And ECG also suggests left ventricular hypertrophy with hypokinesia. So based on this, if we just break down the case, there are some important clues here. What are the major clues in this question? Was a baby in the neonatal period with severe floppiness or hypotonia. That was the number one. Number two, where there were features of cardiac failure in the sense that the baby was having tachypnea, tachycardia. Along with that, you have noticed that the echo shows hypokinesia with left ventricular hypertrophy. See, there is hypertrophy along with hypokinesia, suggesting there is a decreased contractility of the ventricle. So both these findings suggest that the baby is having cardiac failure, but the underlying condition could be that the baby is having some form of hypertrophic cardiomyopathy as well. Now, in addition to floppiness and cardiac problem, there was also a liver involvement along with elevated CPK. Now, this creatine phosphokinase tells you some problem related to the pathology of the muscles. So, this child was having liver involvement, muscle involvement, heart involvement along with severe floppiness. So, all these things point together to not just one particular straightforward diagnosis, but a group of disorder which is involving the multiple systems, especially the cardiac muscles as well as the skeletal muscle, because the child is having hypotonia with elevated CPK. Now, to an extent, the liver is also affected, but major problem is in the cardiac muscle and in the skeletal muscle. So, this being the question, I would put forward the diagnosis as a storage disorder, which is involving again the glycogen storage, but this time which is more often involving the muscle. So, I will call this as a muscle type of glycogen storage disorder. But the specialty of this disorder was that it was not only involving the skeletal muscle, it was also involving the cardiac muscles. So, the only one type or the important type of muscle glycogen storage disorder, which is involving both the skeletal muscle and the cardiac muscle, is Pompe's disease, which is type 2 glycogen storage disorder. Also, has to be noted, in Pompe's disease, macroglossia is also one of the important clinical findings, and that has been given in this particular case also. So, for this particular question, the diagnosis is Pompe's disease, which is type 2 glycogen storage disorder.
So we have seen a muscle glycogen storage disorder. So if you divide the muscle glycogen storage disorder, it is divided into one with hypertrophic cardiomyopathy and without hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. That's what the sir has told you, that involvement of cardiac muscle is pointing towards the Pompey's disease, right? So, involving hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, the muscle glycogen storage disorder, that is the Pompey's disease, right? Now, in the Pompey's disease, it's a lysosomal storage disorder. Don't forget that it's a lysosomal storage disorder. This is the only one glycogen storage disorder which is also a lysosomal storage disorder. And where is the enzyme defect here? The enzyme defect here is a lysosomal enzyme which, a part of glycogenolysis is also taking place inside the lysosomes. Very small amount, very meager amount. So, if that is going to get affected, this is causing the Pompey's disease. What is the enzyme that is defective here? The enzyme that is defective here is alpha 1,4 glucosidase. This is also, I have to add a word here, acid, because this is called acid, alpha 1,4 acid glucosidase, or it is also called as acid maltase. Okay, so this is the enzyme defect here. So, as sir has told, the very important thing is the floppy hypotonia, then macroglossia and hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. So, if we just brush through the other muscle glycogen storage disorder, now the two important one is the McArdle's disease and the Tarwi's disease. In McArdle's disease, otherwise the type 5 glycogen storage disorder, the enzyme that is defective is the muscle glycogen phosphorylase or simply muscle phosphorylase. In Tarwi's disease, the enzyme that is defective is the muscle and erythrocyte phosphofructokinase. So, that is the defect in Tarwi's disease. Now, when you compare all these things, we know that in muscle glycogen storage disorder, there is exercise intolerance. So, both of them are having exercise intolerance and rhabdomyolysis, which is causing the burgundy colored urine. Now, so in the case of Tarwi's disease, apart from that, a very characteristic feature will be compensated hemolysis, because this is affecting the glycolysis in the erythrocytes as well. So, there is compensated hemolysis apart from rhabdomyolysis in Tarwi's disease. Then one more interesting feature in McArdle's disease is the second wind phenomenon. Which is seen in McArdle's disease, not in Tarwi's disease. So, sir will come to the diagnosis in that particular case that we have discussed just now.
So, ma'am has very clearly discussed about the different types of muscle glycogen storage disorder. And in the case which we were discussing, the diagnosis was Pompey's disease. Now, look at the options. How do you confirm your diagnosis of Pompey's disease? Very clearly, the answer was option C, which is estimation of alpha glucosidase activity. Now, look at the other options. Troponin I is for myocardial infarction. Muscle phosphorylase, as you have just heard, is for Anderson disease, where you have only skeletal muscle involvement without cardiomyopathy. Last is estimation of uric acid and lipid level. That is for von Guericke disease, which is involving only the liver and will not have any muscle involvement. So, that option is also ruled out. So, very clearly for this question, the answer is option C, and the diagnosis is Pompey's disease.
Okay, now we will discuss the case 6. It's a 7-year-old male presented with complaints of weakness, pallor and progressive abdominal distension since the age 2 years. He has history of recurrent skin bleeds and epistaxis for the past 3 years. There is no history of weight loss, prolonged fever and night sweats. There was a history of 3 blood transfusions in the past, starting at the age of 2 years. Physical examination reveals a pale child with hepatosplenomegaly and generalized tenderness over the long bones. The lab investigation revealed anemia, thrombocytopenia, elevated liver function test. Bone marrow aspiration reveals the following findings with normal erythroid, myeloid and megakaryocytic lineage. What is the likely diagnosis? The options are tropical splenomegaly syndrome, autoimmune hemolytic anemia, Niemann-Pick's disease and Gaucher disease. So, that picture itself should help you to come to a diagnosis. Very characteristic picture. So the how to approach this question will be explained by Singaram sir.
So looking at the approach to this particular case, you can see that it was a gradual onset of some disorder which has got a very long duration starting few years back. So this should make you think about a chronic disorder. Now, with this history of this chronic disorder itself, among the given options, I would rule out autoimmune hemolytic disorder because autoimmune hemolytic disorder is very unlikely to have a chronic presentation. The classical presentation is with recurrent episodes of hemolysis, acute episodes of hemolysis, where the child will have pallor, jaundice, along with some liver involvement, but that will not be a chronic history. It will be like a acute history which is repeated. So we can rule out autoimmune hemolytic anemia straight away. Second important finding in this where there were clinical and lab evidence of anemia and thrombocytopenia because the child had clinically pallor along with bleeding manifestation, and lab evidence also confirmed anemia with thrombocytopenia. Not only that, there was also a history of recurrent blood transfusion, meaning that there is some problem which is involving the bone marrow also in this particular child. So at this stage, we may think about something like a chronic disorder involving the bone marrow. But there was one more important clue also given in the question that child also had hepatosplenomegaly or organomegaly along with elevated liver function tests. So this is not just a disorder which is limited to bone marrow only. It is also related to organomegaly with involvement of the liver particularly. So keeping with this, all of these into consideration, when we just go back to the options, I'll just go back to the options. We have got three options which are left. One is tropical splenomegaly syndrome. Second is Niemann-Pick disease. And third is the Gaucher's disease. Now, first thing, I can eliminate straight away tropical splenomegaly syndrome because in tropical splenomegaly syndrome, the characteristic feature is that the child has got a massive abdominal distension and that is due to a gross splenomegaly. Liver is not involved much here. Second important point is in tropical splenomegaly syndrome, which is believed to be due to a chronic malarial infection, there will be elevated levels of IgEM antibody levels, which is not given in this case. So very safely we can rule out tropical splenomegaly syndrome also in this particular question. So we are left with two options. One is a Niemann-Pick disease. Second is a Gaucher's disease. Both are storage disorder, okay, which you must be knowing, and they are characterized by involvement of the liver and the spleen, both of them present with hepatosplenomegaly. But what is the distinguishing feature between the two things is the other point given in the question, that is the bone marrow involvement characterized by anemia and thrombocytopenia. Please remember bone marrow involvement with anemia, thrombocytopenia, as well as the clinical features of bone pain or fractures are only associated with Gaucher's disease and not associated with Niemann-Pick disease. Niemann-Pick disease will have hepatosplenomegaly but will not have any bony involvement. So very clearly we can point to the diagnosis of Gaucher's disease. And as ma'am was very clearly telling in the question itself that this particular picture, this histopathology finding is very, very characteristic, wherein you are seeing that one particular cell which is highlighted as a big cell, wherein the nucleus is pushed to the periphery. You notice the characteristic feature of the cytoplasm. It is something like a wrinkled tissue paper appearance, which I think all of you must have read about. Wrinkled tissue paper appearance of the cytoplasm is very, very characteristic of Gaucher's disease. So I would put forth the diagnosis as Gaucher disease in this particular case scenario. So we have, so I have just put up in this picture regarding the magnified view of the cell I was talking about and just compared it with the tissue paper, which is a crumpled tissue paper appearance of the cytoplasm, very, very classical of Gaucher disease. Now, just a look at the other options. I have told you in tropical splenomegaly, you will have elevated IgM and gross splenomegaly, which was not mentioned. Hence, it is ruled out. Autoimmune hemolytic anemia will have recurrent episodes of anemia with jaundice, which is not mentioned. So, again, it is ruled out. Third is the Niemann-Pick disease, which is another storage disorder. But here, the bone marrow is not involved. And the typical appearance is that here you have accumulation of the lipid derivatives, which is nothing but the sphingomyelin, so that you will have accumulation of those lipids around in the cytoplasm of the cell, which is what we call it as a foam cell appearance, which is characteristic of Niemann-Pick disease. That was not given in the question, so that option was also out. So very clearly for our particular question, the answer is Gaucher's disease.
So once we have arrived at a diagnosis of Gaucher disease, where is the metabolic defect in Gaucher disease? This Gaucher disease is coming under sphingolipidosis. Now we know that these sphingolipidosis are also lysosomal storage disorder. Inside the lysosome, certain enzymes are lacking, which is leading to this particular disorder. Which is the enzyme that is deficient in Gaucher disease? The enzyme that is affected is, we know that glucocerebroside. Glucocerebroside is converted to ceramide by enzyme beta glucocerebrosidase, also known as beta glucosidase. Okay, like if there is a deficiency here, what is happening is the glucocerebroside will accumulate. The glucocerebroside will accumulate. So this is the basic defect in Gaucher disease. So that's what I've told. It's a sphingolipidosis, and this enzyme, like all the sphingolipidosis, there is some or the other lysosomal enzymes. These lysosomal enzyme which is involved here is generally we call it as the lysosomal hydrolases, because all these enzymes belongs to the class of hydrolases. So that is what is happening here, and as a result of this, what happens is there is usually in the sphingolipidosis, if there is a lysosomal, like in sphingolipidosis, if there is a defect in lysosomal hydrolases, generally what is accumulating is a substance which share a common structure called the ceramide. The ceramide is also N-acyl glycoside. It's an N-acyl glycoside. Okay, right? So generally we just remember, if there is the accumulating substance is something which is related to the basic structure or basic compound which is called as the ceramide. So same thing is happening here also, particularly in this case it is the glucocerebroside that is accumulating. Now like in this particular case, what we have seen that once the glucocerebroside is accumulating, it is accumulating in the reticuloendothelial system. That is why the liver is affected, to an extent the spleen is also affected. So there is hepatosplenomegaly. There is hepatosplenomegaly, and the glucocerebroside will also accumulate in the bone marrow. So that is why there is pancytopenia, and this lead to bleeding manifestation. So that is what is given in the history also. So there was epistaxis, bleeding manifestation, and that is the reason for pain and pathological fractures, especially the long bones, in the pain and pathological fractures of long bones. So this is the basis of the biochemical basis of various clinical feature in the Gaucher disease, and also I have explained what is the enzyme defect in Gaucher disease.
So we've now moved to the last case for this session, that is regarding a 1-month-old baby who presented with repeated episodes of seizures and refusal of feeds for the past 2 days. The baby was born by breech delivery and perinatal period was uneventful. Seizures were controlled with phenobarbital and fosphenytoin. Now you have stabilized the baby, and after stabilization, you notice the following important findings on examination. The baby, as in a general impression, had a flat nose and a flat face along with flat occiput. You also notice that the baby has wide open anterior fontanelle with a high forehead, upward slanting of the palpebral fissures, hypertelorism, epicanthal folds, and brushfield spots. Baby also had simian crease and clinodactyly. And the systemic examination was suggestive of marked hypotonia with sluggish reflexes and hepatomegaly. A loud pansystolic murmur of ventricular septal defect was also heard. Ultrasound abdomen reveals a hepatomegaly along with the finding of renal cyst. Karyotyping was done and it is 46XY. Please note that it's a male baby, so 46XY is absolutely normal. Which of the following investigations will help in the diagnosis? Now, when I was reading the history, the first part mentioned about the seizure and its control with anti-epileptic medication. The second part mentioned about some characteristic findings in the face, which I'm sure all of you must have come to a conclusion when I was reading halfway itself. But when I read the second part of the history, that is the second part of the that particular passage, I think you must had a doubt in your diagnosis, especially because I had mentioned the karyotypic findings, right? So we can see the options. The options given are CFTR mutation analysis, estimation of VLCFA, ATP7B gene mutation, estimation of hexosaminidase A activity. Now, before I discuss the options, let me discuss the case first. Now, in this particular case, very clearly the question was about a baby presenting with recurrent episodes of seizures which were controlled with anti-epileptic medication. But there was also mention about facial dysmorphism, like this flat nose, occiput, face, everything, along with the upward slanting of the palpebral fissures, what we call it as a mongoloid slant of the eyes, along with epicanthal folds and brushfield spots in the iris, along with the simian crease and clinodactyly, along with that heart disease, which is VSD. Now, when I mentioned this, you must have concluded that this is a very classical case of Down syndrome, right? That is what everybody is expecting because of this characteristic facial findings which you get in this particular case, which is mimicking exactly like a Down syndrome. But what was given in the very next passage of that particular question, it was not Down syndrome very, very clearly because the karyotype was normal. It was a male baby and it was 46XY. So very clearly the karyotype was normal. Hence, there is no question about Down syndrome in this particular case. One more thing which was mentioned in the question was marked hypotonia, or what we call it as floppiness. Please remember that in Down syndrome, there is some degree of hypotonia, but very severe hypotonia or floppiness is never encountered in Down syndrome, and that will tell you some other diagnosis. And in addition, you noted in the question that there was involvement of liver, hepatomegaly was present, as well as ultrasound was showing renal cortical cyst. All these tells you it's a condition which is mimicking a Down syndrome, but not a Down syndrome. So what is this Down syndrome mimicking condition? And that is what is this question talking about? The answer is a Down syndrome-like facies with seizures, that is involvement of CNS, along with hepatomegaly, along with renal cyst. And the diagnosis is something which is given as cerebro-hepatorenal syndrome, or what we call it as a Zellweger syndrome, which is a classical type of disorder grouped under the peroxisomal disorders, where you will have a problem in the oxidation of very long chain fatty acids, resulting in the accumulation of very long chain fatty acids. So for this particular question, the answer is option B, which is estimation of very long chain fatty acid, because the diagnosis here is Zellweger syndrome, which is a problem of very long chain fatty acid oxidation.
So that was a class apart approach to a case, like cerebro, hepatorenal, everything beautifully explained. Now we'll just dive into the basics. Where is the defect here? What's the problem here? There is, we know that the ribosomes, this is a polyribosome. In the ribosome, the protein synthesis is taking place, right? We all know that. Like, we know the ribosomes can be either studded on the endoplasmic reticulum, which is the RER, rough endoplasmic reticulum, or it can be the free ribosome, that's the cytosolic. Like, in all these places, the ribosomes are synthesizing what? It is synthesizing the proteins, right? These proteins should reach the right target. It is synthesizing proteins not to be eaten up by themselves. It has to reach different targets. If we want to put a WhatsApp message, what we should be having, we should have a correct number, WhatsApp number. Then only it will go to the inbox of that person. Otherwise, it will be in the cloud. Like, same thing. So if we don't have the correct address in which is tagged onto this protein, what's going to happen is that these proteins are not going to reach the targeted organ. So where is the defect here? These kind of defects are called as the protein targeting disorder. So Zellweger syndrome is one of the protein targeting disorder. And which protein targeting disorder? It's a peroxisomal protein targeting disorder. So that is what is given here. So the cytosolic proteins can be has to be targeted to various organs like mitochondria, nucleus, peroxisome. That is mostly to the organelle. The proteins are coming from the cytosolic path. Like if it is towards some membrane, for example, ER membrane, endoplasmic reticulum membrane itself, the membrane also needs some proteins, right? So to the the proteins that has to reach the endoplasmic reticulum membrane or retained inside the membrane itself, Golgi apparatus membrane or the plasma membrane. One exception where you can find an organelle in that in that branch will be in the RER branch will be the lysosomes. So this is the different protein targeting, and there are different signals in this class like this. I cannot explain all the signals, but I should say that here the defect is in a signal that is targeting some proteins towards the peroxisome. Okay, now in this, there is a gene defect. Where is the gene defect? This gene which codes for certain proteins which is helping in the signaling of these protein towards which organ? Towards the peroxisome. So if there is a defect in that gene which is coding for peroxins, peroxins are a set of proteins which helps in the signaling of the proteins towards the peroxisomes. There are various peroxins. So when there is a defect in the synthesis of this peroxin due to a gene mutation here, these peroxisomal proteins that should reach the peroxisome, if it is not attached with these signals, what will happen? This will not reach the peroxisome. So what are the functions of the peroxisome? See, the peroxisome is functioning because of what? Because of the enzymes present in it, right? What are these enzymes? Enzymes are nothing but the proteins. So if the proteins are not reaching the peroxisome, means the peroxisome will be having a ghost-like appearance, because there is nothing inside the peroxisome. So these peroxisome will be peroxisomal ghost. The peroxisomal ghost. And after sometimes what happens is that the body is thinking, why this peroxisome is not doing any function, right? So we will synthesize less number of peroxisomes. So there is decreased amount of peroxisomes. Okay. Now, in effect, what happens is that decreased no enzymes inside the peroxisomes. If there is no enzyme, the peroxisome cannot do its function, because to do its function it needs the enzyme. So if the enzymes are lacking, what all functions are affected? Then the number one is the beta oxidation of very long chain fatty acids. Sir was also telling something about VLCFA. So there comes the defect. If the enzymes are not, the VLCFA oxidation is affected. Then the plasmalogen synthesis. Then certain stages of bile acid synthesis. Bile acid synthesis is affected. Then another important function is the alpha oxidation. Now there is accumulation of phytanic acid in Zellweger syndrome, because the alpha oxidation, these are the, alpha oxidation is to oxidize the phytanic acid. It's a branched chain. So alpha oxidation, if it is affected, accumulation of phytanic acid. So these are the defects in a case that has been beautifully explained by sir. So this is what is called as a Zellweger syndrome. So this these kind of disorders are collectively called as the peroxisomal biogenesis disorders. Now there is a spectrum of peroxisomal biogenesis disorder which we call it as PBD. Now in this spectrum, we can see three main disorders. Like the least severe is the infantile Refsum's disease. The most severe, which we have seen just now, is the Zellweger syndrome. In between, what we can see is the neonatal adrenoleukodystrophy. So these are all coming under peroxisomal biogenesis disorder. The basic defect in all these things is the protein targeting towards the peroxisome. So we have seen the protein targeting disorder called Zellweger syndrome. The other protein targeting disorders, which you should be learning, and you should be learning more about it, is one is the eye cell disease, that is otherwise the inclusion cell disease, which proteins towards which organelle is affected here. It's a lysosomal protein targeting disorder. Like if there is a lysosomal protein targeting disorder called eye cell disease, this resemble mucopolysaccharidosis. Why? Because mucopolysaccharides are degraded inside the lysosome. Same thing will happen. If the enzymes are not reaching the lysosome cannot function. Then Refsum's disease. In the Refsum's disease, it's a single enzyme defect. And that enzyme is the phytonyl coenzyme hydroxylase. There are certain distinguishing features for the Refsum's disease. One is the retinitis pigmentosa. Then peripheral neuropathy. Then ichthyosis. Then cardiac abnormalities like cardiac arrhythmias. So these are some of the distinguishing features of Refsum disease. It's not a classically peroxisomal biogenesis disorder because all the enzymes are not affected. Only one enzyme is affected, and that is phytonyl coenzyme hydroxylase defect. So that is about the Refsum's disease.
So ma'am has very clearly explained about the clinical spectrum correlated with the biochemical aspects of peroxisomal disorders. In this particular case, it was the disorder which was of a severe variety, and that was mimicking a Down syndrome, which is what we called it as Zellweger syndrome. So the answer is going to be estimation of very long chain fatty acids, which will be elevated because they are not properly going to be oxidized in this particular condition. So that's about the discussion of this particular case. So we have come to the end of this session. As a summary, in this particular session, we have learned about the metabolic disorders, mainly about the disorders in the carbohydrate and fatty acid oxidation pathways. As you can see from the questions which we discussed, it will be a long question only. But in one particular question, you will have 3 or 4 clues. And if you can just correlate the clues, you can very easily come to a particular diagnosis. Regarding the type of questions which can be asked, it is not always straightforward. What is the diagnosis? They can ask you something related to the investigation which can help you to come to the diagnosis, or they can ask you about something related to the clinical features of the particular question asked in that particular case scenario, or they can also ask you about relevant therapeutic aspects of the particular condition which has been given in the case. So you need to know about the basics, as ma'am has very clearly explained it in every particular case scenario. So that will have an implication on the clinical findings, which are going to be the presentation of that particular case. I would also like to thank ma'am for making us very clear in the transition from the biochemical aspect to the pediatric or the clinical aspect by correlating, so that there is no chance of us making mistake whenever that particular topic is going to be again asked in this in your upcoming exams.
So how shall we proceed? We should learn biochemistry along with pediatrics. That means we should change our attitude from, or the way of learning, from a H shape to a Z shape. No, H shape previously, preclinical years, paraclinical years, then the clinical years. Now it has changed to a Z shape, where you can see the clinical knowledge and the skill should be correlated in every aspects of the basics. So from the first year onwards, you should be clinically orienting and learning. Then only we can answer such questions. And once we have finished your MBBS, if you are preparing for your exams also, you have to learn it in an integrated fashion, which you just see my videos on how to approach, like how to learn various biochemistry, how to learn biochemistry. In that, I have clearly explained how to learn all the subjects in an integrated manner. So this is the beauty of learning clinical subjects along with a preclinical subject. So if you learn like this, biochemistry is not a boring subject because we are learning it with clinical correlation, right? So I should thank Dr. Singaram for making that how to approach so beautiful, so that I can could easily could make a basic, we can learn about the basic along with the clinics, that was well explained by him. And thank you, Dr.
Thank you.
Singaram sir, for that.
Thank you, ma'am.